Alright, so today we are talking about Socrates' argument as to why he should drink the hemlock based on his sentencing as written in Plato's Crito. And Socrates' argument follows 5 premises and then 1 conclusion. We have them listed out here, but they are: 1. Socrates has agreed to abide by the laws. 2. To refuse to abide by the laws after such an agreement is to break an agreement. 3. It is not right to break an agreement. 4. If Socrates chooses to escape, he breaks an agreement. 5. Socrates ought not escape. It is not right for him to escape. And then our conclusion: Socrates ought to drink the hemlock instead of escaping. We, however, disagree with Socrates, and our thesis is that he should not drink the hemlock. While his argument is valid, at least 2 of his premises are false, which makes his overall argument unsound.
Alright, so Socrates' first main point is that he has agreed to abide by the laws, which he believes is inherent because he has chosen to stay in the city his entire life, therefore showing by his deeds, if not by his words, that he's agreed to live as a citizen. He chose Athens over any other foreign city, Greek or otherwise, showing that he was satisfied by Athens, which he believes shows that he was satisfied by Athens' laws, for who would be satisfied by a city but not by its laws? Therefore, Socrates says if he was dissatisfied, he could have left, but he has agreed with his actions to do whatever the city commands. This is our first major point of objection because we believe that Socrates did not consent to live in the city and his consent was coerced. In Simmons's article on consent, he lays out a framework for consent that shows it must be freely given with adequate time to object and with consequences to objection that are not overly severe. However, for Socrates to have removed his tacit consent from the city, he would have had to emigrate, which we believe was an overly severe consequence of objection. Therefore, his consent was not freely given. Potential counterarguments to this point are as follows. Socrates believed he consented even enough to drink the hemlock, which we would respond to by saying Socrates is working with a very limited understanding of consent, and a person can still be wronged even if they believe they have not been wronged, which we believe was the case with Socrates in Crito. The second objection to our point is that Socrates' consent was not coerced, in that it is not too much to ask people to emigrate if they do not consent to the politics of their state. However, this form of protest is not available to everyone with certain economic means. So Socrates saying that everyone tacitly consents by staying in a city is privileged and fundamentally untrue. Furthermore, if conditions are in fact worse in other states, as Socrates claims in the dialogue itself, there is added coercive pressure to immigration in that the future city could be even more unjust. The second objection that we have, even if you believe that Socrates did consent, is that consent is not immutable and it can and should be revoked. Even if Socrates consented for the years that he lived in Athens, his consent is not necessarily eternal. Consent needs to be consistently given. And Socrates had the right to remove his consent when the city turned on him unjustly. His view of consent as eternal is limited and childish.
Socrates' second point is that to refuse to abide by the laws after such an agreement is to break an agreement. And he's saying that he has agreed to these laws by his actions his entire life. Like we discussed in the previous slides, he has tacitly consented to abide by the laws, and then he equates breaking the law to breaking his agreement to follow the laws. His third point, which is the next one that we have issue with, is that it is not right to break an agreement. He says that one should do the things that one has agreed with someone to do, even in the cases of injustice. So Socrates holds the opinion that one wrong does not rectify another wrong. So he thinks that there is no difference between doing a wrong even in response to a wrong and doing a moral injustice. So he thinks that breaking his agreement, even if he has been wronged, is also a wrong and therefore is morally impermissible. Our objection to this point is, first off, his statement is that it is not right to break an agreement. And that's just kind of a general vague statement. Is it never correct to break an agreement? Is it sometimes not right? Is it usually advised not to? We think that maybe an agreement should change when the conditions it was made under change. Concretely, Socrates lived through 3 different rules in the city of Athens, so perhaps the agreement that he originally consented to has changed over time. But he treats all agreements as immutable. which we think is irrational and dangerous. A potential counter argument to our response would be maybe a strict believer in contracts would say, regardless of the situation, it's never right to break an agreement. We would bring the counterpoint that what about immoral agreements? Is one truly obligated to follow through with an evil agreement, or is it morally preferable to break an agreement over harming others or performing an immoral act? There are tons of examples of this, but in the case of Socrates, I think it's easy to make the extension that his complicitness with the way that the city is abusing its own legal system could in fact harm many more people than his refusal to drink the hemlock.
All right, the other points in Socrates' argument kind of follow from the premises that we've already talked about, but the fourth one is if Socrates chooses to escape, he breaks an agreement. He agreed at his trial to stand by whatever judgments the city rendered, which he says forms a binding agreement. Therefore, escaping would be ignoring the punishment the majority decided, and following from points 1 through 3, escaping breaks this agreement. Point 5 is that Socrates ought not to escape, meaning it is not morally right for him to escape. And we believe this follows logically from points 1 through 4, in that breaking agreements is wrong, and escaping is breaking an agreement, therefore it is wrong to escape. And point 6 is Socrates' conclusion that he ought to drink the hemlock instead of escaping, which follows from point 5. The only morally correct action for Socrates, if his points 1 through 5 are true, is for him to drink the hemlock. So, our conclusion is that points 1 and 3 of Socrates' argument are false, and therefore his conclusion, we can reject his conclusion and call it incorrect. He should not drink the hemlock.
And one last point is, even if you don't buy any of our rejection of points 1 and 3 and our discussion of that, the final issue that we have is that Socrates personifies the laws as immutable keepers of the peace and equates them with justice as a moral concept. And we believe that given the massively subjective nature and just the procedural complexity of any legal system, this seems irrational and a completely incorrect interpretation of his sentencing. His choice to personify the laws throughout the dialogue, while Plato's choice weighs very heavily on the conclusion of his argument. He basically entirely ignores any human error and ignores any procedure inherent in practice of law. Everyone has seen that the law can be and often is unjust, and Socrates refuses to accept that, and in place sees it as a perfect system, which we think is just false.